Hello, my name is Marie Arana, and I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress. Welcome to this session of the National Book Festival Presents, and to this very special series, Connecting the World with Words. We are right now, in this third decade of the 21st century, living in undeniably interesting times. And yet, in this program, we want to take you back to another undeniably interesting time, an era that might even teach us a great deal about this present day. I'm talking about the dramatic, fateful years of the 1930s and the 1940s. It was a time when the world seemed to be falling apart, and when the right words never seemed more necessary. And a great statesman rose to say them, and that man was Winston Churchill. Churchill was the son of an American mother and a British father, raised in relative privilege, but not a particularly good student, nor a promising youth, nor anyone who seemed destined for greatness. Nevertheless, he became an extraordinary world leader and a keen observer of his time. Here to tell us that story about Churchill in the crucible of history is Erik Larson. Erik is the author of many terrific bestsellers, as you probably know. Among them are The Devil in the White City, Dead Wake, The Last Crossing of the Lusitania, and Thunderstruck. In conversation with Erik about Churchill's enduring legacy of leadership and oratory in a very difficult time is David Rubenstein, a great friend of the Library of Congress. David himself is the author of a recent book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, as well as a forthcoming book on leadership called How to Lead. He's also the co-chair of the National Book Festival. David, welcome back.
Erik, thank you very much for letting us talk to you today. I would like to open by asking you this question. The world doesn't lack for books on Winston Churchill. So what made you think that a book on just 1940 would be appealing to people, and why did you get so interested in that project in that year?
Believe me, David, this is a question over the last 4.5 years that I asked myself probably every single day, because as I'm sure you're aware, there's been so much done about Churchill. And, you know, what happened with this book was I did not, at its inception, I did not set out to do a book about Churchill. That was not my original concept. My idea was to try to come to terms with how people could possibly have gotten through those 57 consecutive nights of bombing during what we know as the Blitz. How could they have actually endured that, given our experience in the United States of 9/11? And I thought first I was just going to do a book about the quintessential London family. And then I thought, wait a minute, that family is Churchill. Churchill and his family, his advisors. And so that's what made me start to do this. And you know, I was confident that I had a reasonably fresh window on Churchilliana, if you wish. You know, this idea of looking at that period that during the German air campaign, which included what we know as the Blitz, and then 6 more months after that, that if by looking at the world through that lens, which nobody really had done before, on how they all coped on a day-to-day basis, that I'd be able to say something new. So that's how I got into it.
Okay. So how long did it take you to do the research?
You know, it is always a difficult thing to estimate because the research never ends. I mean, it never ends until actually you're looking at the second pass proofs and checking for little, you know, uncrossed T's and undotted I's. But the bulk of the research I like to try to do in the first couple of years of my research. I would like to get a critical mass under my belt before I start to write. But the writing almost invariably begins before the research is completely done. It's like the book just sort of starts to have to come out.
Now, you do all the research yourself, is that correct?
That is correct. I don't have any assistants. Yeah, that's why I do it. Now, and the reason I do that is because, I mean, this is going to sound strange. When I'm in an archive, I never know what I'm looking for until I actually find it. And then I trust my instincts to tell me that this is exactly what I need for the book. And I don't know that I could trust anybody else. So okay. That's.
Now, did the Churchill family cooperate with you in any way?
The Churchill Society cooperated with me in a huge way, and Mary Churchill's daughter was gracious enough to give me permission to look at Mary's diary, which at the time only one other person had actually had the opportunity to do. So, call that cooperation? Yeah.
So when you began the project, did you admire Winston Churchill, or weren't sure about him? And did you emerge from this admiring him more or less or about the same?
Oh, when I went into this, I actually didn't really. I mean, I was as knowledgeable about as the next guy about Churchill. I mean, I didn't idolize him. I didn't think him a particular hero, a particular anti-hero. I just was interested in how he got through this experience. In the course of my research, though, I really gained a new respect for the man in terms of his leadership abilities, but also just in terms of who he was, his character, and also his sense of fun. So, yeah, I came away, and this is unusual for me when I work on a book. I mean, I find that after a while, I get pretty sick of my main characters, but I really came to really like Churchill.
So what was the biggest surprise about Churchill in all your research that you uncovered?
Yeah, the biggest surprise to me was actually that he was a lot of fun. I mean, don't get me wrong, Churchill was a deeply flawed character. He could be incredibly inconsiderate to his staff. He could be rude. He could be abrupt, but he was also an awful lot of fun. And this is what endeared him actually to his private secretariat, his secretaries, and so forth. One of the scenes in the book that I most love was when I came across the fact that Churchill, during one of his dinner parties at the prime ministerial country estate Chequers, when after this dinner party with all these dignitaries they gathered in the great hall of Chequers. Churchill turns on the gramophone. It's got martial music, and he proceeds to do bayonet drills in the great hall. And he's wearing, at this point, his light blue siren suit, which is a one-piece jumpsuit that he designed so that it could be pulled on at a moment's notice, under his flaming red gold dragon dressing gown. And he proceeds to do these very serious bayonet drills, holding a large Mannlicher big game rifle with a bayonet. And I just thought that was hilarious, the idea of this happening. I would love to have been there.
So when you were working on the title of the book, how did the title come to you?
Title has a very specific and immediate inspiration. One character in the book, John Colville, was one of Churchill's cadre of private secretaries. So I actually like to think of more as apprentice prime ministers, given the amount of work they did and the responsibilities they had. Colville kept against all national security protocols, Colville kept a very detailed daily diary of the events at 10 Downing Street. One entry, one night, he is watching an air raid unfold through a bedroom window, as one does. He's watching this air raid unfold. It's a beautiful night. It's sable sky, searchlights, bombs, the whole deal. And he is struck by how cataclysmically beautiful it is. And he refers to it as this amazing juxtaposition, as he put it, of natural splendor and human vileness. And right away, I knew that was going to be my name, my title, The Splendid and the Vile.
So let's go back to 1940. Winston Churchill is 65 years old, which in today's American political context isn't that old, but then was probably considered a little bit old to start a new career. He had never been prime minister. The prime minister was Neville Chamberlain. Why did Neville Chamberlain have to resign? And how did Winston Churchill wind up as his successor?
Chamberlain, the feeling was in the House of Commons was that Chamberlain was not up to leading in such a moment as this war. Chamberlain's nicknames were alternately the Coroner and the Old Umbrella, which gives you a sense of his management style. There was a rebellion in the House of Commons. Chamberlain, for all intents and purposes, was thrown out. The king appointed Churchill, who seemed to be the favorite candidate at the time, even though the king himself did not particularly care for Churchill as a candidate. He wanted Lord Halifax to be prime minister. But, Churchill was very popular with the public. And this was something that was a very important factor to work into the equation. Turned out that the king eventually came around, as did many in government, that, maybe Churchill was the right guy.
Churchill had a failed experience in World War I. He was never considered a real star in the sense that he was likely to be prime minister. That he was just so adamant against the Nazis for a couple of years that he had the credibility to lead the British. Is that what helped him get the job?
Well, I think public opinion is a complicated thing, as we know. Did his railing against the Nazis at a time when nobody was listening to that help? I'm sure it did. But I think that one of the important elements of this whole story is, he had never been prime minister. He'd had a checkered political career. He'd been thrown out of the Admiralty in World War I because of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. But the important thing, I think, the salient thing about Churchill is that, above all, in his own mind, he was the hero of the age. He may not have been prime minister yet, but it was going to happen. It was going to happen.
Right. Shortly after he became minister, there was a situation where British troops in Europe had to evacuate at Dunkirk. And it wasn't his fault in the sense that he came in after a lot of that had already started. But wasn't that embarrassing for the British troops to have hundreds of thousands kind of escape from Europe? What was that about?
It was incredibly embarrassing, of course, the Dunkirk evacuation, but it was also incredible relief, because the expectation, as all these troops were gathering on the French coast, was that very few would actually get away, because Hitler's armor was bearing down on the coast. And frankly, a big reason the British and French contingent got away was because of a decision, still kind of hard to interpret today, by Hitler to pause the armored advance, just as they were on the verge of overrunning the entrenchments of the troops on the beach. So was this an embarrassment? Yes. Was it a relief? Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the British troops come back. The French eventually are taken over by the Nazis, and so France is now occupied by the Nazis.
Yes.
The lowlands are occupied by the Nazis, Denmark, Netherlands, and so forth. What is Churchill's strategy? Is it to invade Germany on land, to bomb Germany, or just wait for the Americans to come in and help them?
And first, and on that, let me just go back a little bit to the whole question of embarrassment and the situation of the evacuation. It's very important to understand about this period that at no time in British strategic thinking was it ever contemplated that France would fall. This idea changed completely British strategic assumptions. Now, your question, what was your question again?
Well, the question is, when France fell and the Netherlands is gone, Denmark is gone, and more or less all continental Europe is pretty much under control of the Nazis, what was the strategy that Churchill had to win? Was it to invade Germany, to bomb Germany, or to wait for the Americans to come in? Because it doesn't seem like there was a winning strategy given their resources and given the Nazis' resources. Churchill
would have dearly loved to have been able to turn around and invade, but obviously could not. I mean, he had essentially a 1 million-man army based in England that had no weapons, no equipment, because they'd left it all behind in Dunkirk. So he had very limited offensive abilities at that point. But one thing he understood was that while he could not win, quote unquote, whatever that means, he could not win against Germany and the Nazis. He could hold Germany to a standoff, he believed, until, and this is very important, this was part of his strategy from the very beginning, and truly within 24 hours of his becoming prime minister, he expressed the strategy. The important part of his strategy was to bring America into the war. He understood that the Allies, that Britain could not win this war, could probably hold Germany off at a stalemate, but could not win this war without the United States. And there began this very, I think, very interesting and telling courtship of Roosevelt by Churchill.
So when the Americans didn't come in until Pearl Harbor, why were the Americans so unwilling to come to the aid of the British?
Well, quite a few factors. First of all, it wasn't that they were British, obviously, that why they didn't come to their aid. There was a deep reluctance to get entangled in foreign conflict within the United States. There had been World War I, and of course, the Spanish flu associated with that as well. But there had been World War I, great losses. The public in America was completely against this idea of getting into this war. Roosevelt understood that at some point, most likely, we would have to get into this war. But he understood that he was in a very tricky situation. He was thinking about running for a third term, hadn't quite committed yet, and was keeping that very much to himself. The public was very much against getting involved. The calculus was very tricky for Roosevelt, how to help Britain without actually becoming a belligerent, which of course is what Churchill had wanted.
So let's talk about Hitler. Why did Hitler not invade England? I mean, he had the resources, presumably. Why did he just not do an invasion of England and end the war right then and there?
That's a fascinating question, and one I would love to pursue in a speculative history that explores what would happen if he actually done it. A number of factors there as well. First of all, Hitler was wary of, as they say, he was wary of the water. He was wary of amphibious ventures, and justly so, because Germany had a nowhere near the naval strength necessary to be able to pull this off, just using the forces that it had. But it was also the case. That Hitler understood, and Churchill understood that for Germany to actually be able to invade England, to invade the British Isles, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would first have to achieve air superiority. Hitler knew it. Churchill knew it. Therefore, it was, I think, one of the remarkable insights early on by Churchill, again, within the first 24 hours, was the necessity for ramping up production of fighter aircraft, because he understood that the only way to deny the Germans their superiority was fighters. Bombers weren't going to do it. They needed fighters to stop the advance of German fighters and German bombers. And to that end, I think one of the most brilliant things that he didn't do a lot, he did many things right, he did many things wrong, but one of the most brilliant things I feel that he did was that in that first 24 hours as prime minister, he appointed Lord Beaverbrook, a newspaper baron and longtime friend. He made him the Minister of Aircraft Production in a whole new ministry, the Ministry of Aircraft Production. And he picked the right man for the job. Beaverbrook was universally reviled, but Churchill understood him to be exactly the disorganizing force that might be needed let's not say disorganized, let's say galvanizing force to get the British aircraft industry ramped up to produce as many fighters as they possibly could. And Beaverbrook absolutely succeeded.
So the Nazi strategy was to weaken the British by bombing them, and maybe they would quit, or maybe they would just be so weak that they could be invaded. But who was the head of the Luftwaffe that ran that strategy?
Yeah, so the chief of the Luftwaffe and its founder was Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering, a very interesting, very complicated character. He was, on paper, Rudolf Hess was the number 2 in Hitler's government, but really it was Hermann Goering whom Hitler had anointed as the guy to be his successor in case Hitler passed away or was captured or whatever. But Hermann Goering was a very ambitious guy. He was a very narcissistic guy. I refer to him as being joyously corrupt. And he loved this Air Force of his and was very proud of it and believed in its prowess to an extent that exceeded reality. He believed, because of Hitler's wariness of invasion, Goering believed that Goering promised that he would be able to bring Britain to its knees just with the Air Force alone, which was in hindsight kind of a ridiculous promise, but nonetheless he made it.
So in 1940, how many times did the German Luftwaffe drop bombs on England? And was it every day, or did they vary it by week? What was their strategy, and how many days were there that dropped bombs on England?
Could not tell you how many sorties, how many bombs were dropped. There were there were just so many. But I'll tell you. But here's how it began. There are a lot of misconceptions about the Blitz and this German air campaign, which is why I actually prefer to avoid the term Blitz and refer to it as the German air campaign, because it includes, the preamble, then it includes the 57 consecutive nights of bombing of London, and then another 6 months of intensifying raids, but at longer intervals until May 10, 41, when it essentially, this first very important air campaign came to an end. But it began with the Luftwaffe first attacking ships in the Channel. Then there were more probes overland, which actually perplexed the British. They didn't really understand what the Luftwaffe was trying to do. It may be that the Luftwaffe was trying to test British strength. It was also absolutely the case that the Luftwaffe was testing a new microwave beam technology for guiding its aircraft, which the British only subsequently stumbled upon. Things began. It's really sort of like the contours of a terrific suspense narrative, because there's a slow buildup toward the bombing of London. One preamble to that being on August 24th, 1940, the Luftwaffe squadron got lost and dropped bombs on central London for the first time against Hitler's express orders. And then came September 7th, when by that time Hitler had decided, Goering, that there's no point in trying to bring Churchill to the peace table. He's just not going to come. We have to bomb London, and that's when the full-on Blitz occurred, and that's when we had the 57 consecutive nights of bombing and many bombs thereafter. So basically, from the time from June 1940 through May 10, 1941, on days when the weather permitted flights and bombing, there was probably a bombing rate of some kind every single day. But the concerted raids on London were from September 7th for 57 days thereafter.
How many British were killed by these bombs? Do you know?
In London, the numbers are in my book, but in London, I believe it was about 40,000 people, and nationwide at another 10,000, something along that order of magnitude.
So with all these people being killed by bombs, did people say, Churchill, you're not defending us very well, and maybe you should leave office? Or what did Churchill do, and why was he able to keep in power?
Oddly enough, in my research, I did not find any sort of rising sense of unhappiness at Churchill because of his inability to defend against this, except on one occasion, and I'll get to that in a moment. From my reading of the Ministry of Information kept very close tabs on morale, and every week issued a so-called home intelligence report. These were amazing things put together from 100 disparate sources of local information, including gossip overheard at W.H. Smith bookstalls. And as best I can tell, there probably were those who were discontented that these bombings continued without any ability to stop them. But for the most part, I didn't get a sense that there was any anger about that, except on September 7th, when the first deliberate bombing occurred. The German bombers and fighters seemed to arrive with impunity, and this was really annoying to the public. It's like dismay. How on earth did all these bombers and fighters get through? I mean, we have the RAF. We're supposed to have all these anti-aircraft guns. What's happening? And the anti-aircraft guns stayed essentially silent for 4 more nights, until Churchill realized we have to start blasting away, essentially. So he basically gave the order that all these anti-aircraft batteries could just start blasting at will, whether at a target or not. And the effect on morale was tremendous. Overnight, the population was galvanized, because at last, they got clear evidence, probably because they couldn't sleep, but clear evidence that something was definitely happening to try to resist the Luftwaffe.
Now, did Churchill use rhetoric to rally the British troops? Did he give a lot of speeches? Did he actually write these speeches himself? And did he write them with a lot of alcohol in them, or he wrote them completely sober?
Well, well, first of all, Churchill did drink. He liked to drink, but according to his staff, he was never inebriated. I mean, he'd start the day with a whiskey and water, and then he'd move on to like champagne and brandy at lunch, and likewise at dinner and so forth. But nobody that I came across seemed to be able to report on any moment when he was actually drunk. So basically, whatever he did when he did these speeches, he did them with some alcohol in his system. But he dictated his speeches, as impossible as that seems, for those of us for whom it's very difficult to compose a paragraph in longhand. But he dictated these speeches to his, ever-present personal secretary, as distinct from his private secretaries. He dictated these speeches, and yes, he did. Did he do every single one? I can't vouch for that, but he did do his own speeches. And the important thing about his speeches, we all know about all his certain fine phrases that have gone down through history. Like never have so many owed so much to so few. But to me, the real strength of his oratory was not so much that, but was how he structured his speeches and what he conveyed in them. He was very good at, first of all, telling the truth. He gave a sober assessment of whatever was going on at the time. Sometimes so sober that in these home intelligence reports, people would be talking about how terrified they were the next day, but also somewhat galvanized. But the thing is, he would be very frank about what was actually happening because, he understood the people were experiencing this thing. They knew what was happening. If you give them happy talk or a false picture, there's going to be a dissonance, and they're not going to trust you anymore. So he told it as it was, but then he would come back with real grounds for optimism. Okay, this is all going bad, but we have this, and here's what we are trying to do, and here's what we are going to do. And then he would finish with these wonderful flourishes, these rhetorical flourishes that would, literally and metaphorically drive people out of their chairs, into the streets feeling like, once again, like they're heroes in this long battle.
So when the British were being bombed by the Nazis and Luftwaffe, was Churchill in an underground bunker, or did he go watch the bombs? And where did he hide out most of the time when he had to hide out?
Churchill was fearless, and wanted everybody, of course, to know that he was fearless. It was often the case when air raids occurred, when everybody else was rushing to the shelters, that Churchill would rush to the nearest rooftop to actually watch the raid. In fact, there's one scene where he's having dinner he's having a little dinner party at that was known as the Number 10 Annex, which was sort of a fortified apartment that took the place of his lodgings in 10 Downing Street. And he's having a dinner and with these guests, and an air raid, very severe air raid, begins. And he goes up onto the roof and brings his guests and staff with him to watch the air raid unfold. And this man has the presence of mind as he's up there on that rooftop to quote Tennyson, to quote a poem called Locksley Hall, which is considered by many to have sort of foretold the advent of aerial warfare. And there he is during this raid, quoting Tennyson. So that's how he approached this.
So your book really, to me, is as much about leadership as it is about Winston Churchill. So you kind of portray Churchill as an incredible leader. Is that what you take away from the book as well, that you have a leader in action and you show 1 year of a great leader doing something to protect his people?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I did not set out to do a book about leadership. As I said, I didn't even intend to do about Churchill, but what I came away with was a real appreciation of his ability to lead and of elements that made him a great leader. One of which, two other examples that I think are very important. One was that in his oratory, he was an extremely well-read man with a tremendous grasp of history. He was also a terrific writer. He wrote voluminously, often about himself. But he had this tremendous grasp of the great sweep of history, and he had a way of putting his listeners into that timeline into that grand history so that they too felt like they were champions of this glorious thing. But it was also the case that Churchill was acutely aware of the power of symbolic acts, even the most minor symbolic act, that being he would never refer to Hitler by name. He would refer to him as that man, that wicked man, which when you think about it is really sort of a very clever, subtle thing. By not deigning to identify this awful character, you somehow demystify. But anyway, with that one end of the continuum, on to these visits of bombed out areas where he made sure that he was seen to be visiting these areas, where he was seen to be talking to people. And it wasn't all show. I mean, he felt a great deal of empathy. This is a man who, when he was walking through the Docklands the day after the September 7th raid, was visibly weeping. And people were really moved and struck by that.
So if you had a chance after spending 4.5 years researching and writing about Churchill to have dinner with him, what question would you want to ask Winston Churchill about the period you've written about?
Oh my gosh, I would have so many questions I'd like to ask, but I guess I would love to know what really possessed him, as this goes a little far afield, what really possessed him to bring into his ministry this character, Friedrich Lindemann, who, AKA the Prof, as his chief science advisor. I mean, it turned out to be a smart thing to do, but he's such an odd character and such a divisive character. But again, maybe that plays also to another strength of Churchill's in terms of leadership. When he appointed advisors, he didn't want happy talk. He knew who they were. He knew what their problems were. He knew that, Beaverbrook was hated by everybody. Lindemann was hated by everybody. And, that's maybe he was better off for it because he would always get the truth.
So do you think the secret to his longevity, he lived to be 90 years old. He drank a lot. He never exercised, and he was overweight. So what do you think the secret was to his longevity? Was it 2 baths a day, or what do you think it was?
I don't know. I'll tell you though, who knows? It'd be so interesting if there was some way to do like a physiobiography, and you could go back and have sort of vital signs for every single day of this period, 1940 to 41. But I have to say that in my weak moments, and I would never try to publish anything along these lines, but I have to say that one thing that strikes me about his use of alcohol was it's sort of a self-sedation, kind of a way perhaps of leveling him out in the course of each day, and thereby reducing stress, which of course we know takes a toll on one's life. But who knows? Maybe the baths. I mean, baths are a very good thing to take. So I don't know, but I think it's remarkable.
Let me ask you a final question. You have a great commercial and literary success in this book. So what are you going to do to top it next time? What's your next book going to be about? Who is going to be able to be as compelling a character as Winston Churchill?
Oh, way to up the pressure, David. Thank you. I am in that phase that is very hard for me when I'm trying to find out what my next book is going to be. I've just eliminated an idea today. I have no idea what my next book is going to be. Only wish I did.
Well, in the meantime, I highly recommend that people read this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I read it pretty much in 2 sittings, and it was hard to put down. So congratulations on this book, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.